Welcome, everyone. Just going to give people a few minutes to find their way into the room, so to speak. So I'm going to say welcome. I'm sure people will continue to come in and do what they do on Zoom, but I feel we should get started. So welcome. My name is Sophia Murphy, and I'm the Executive Director at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and your host for today's conversation. I'm really excited by what we have to offer. It's going to be rich and probably dense. These are complex problems with a long history and some quite serious implications for our future as well. But I'm glad that you're with us, and I'm very excited about who we have with us to explore the questions. So as you've seen, the program is expected to run about 90 minutes. I do hope we'll finish with questions and answers, and at any point, you can use the Q&A function in the Zoom to put your questions down, and we'll do our best to get to them. And if we don't, we can always follow up after. IATP is always interested to be in conversation on these questions. We're going to start with a brief presentation of the paper that Calvin Manduna, my colleague, has written on this question of trade, climate change, and cereals production, and then move to our speakers, and they'll have roughly 10 minutes each to answer some questions I have for them. So let me introduce everyone at the outset. Calvin is a senior trade policy analyst here at the IATP, although based out of our Washington, D.C. office, and I'm speaking to you from Minneapolis. And he is a trade lawyer and a regional integration expert who came to us having worked at the African Development Bank and also the Caribbean Development Bank, and before that had been working in Geneva. He has a master's in international law and economy from the World Trade Institute, and an LLM, which is a law degree from Howard. His original education, I should say, was in South Africa. Our first discussant then is Dr. Joe Glauber, a senior research fellow in the Markets, Trade and Institutions Unit with the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. His areas of interest are price volatility, global grain reserves, crop insurance, and trade, all highly relevant here. And before joining IFPRI, Joe spent over 30 years at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, including as chief economist. As chief economist, he was responsible for the department's agricultural forecasts and projections, oversaw climate, energy, and regulatory issues. And before that, Joe was the special Doha agricultural envoy in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where he served as chief ag negotiator in the Doha trade negotiations. And I'm going into some detail on this because we really do have a lot of expertise on our panel here today. So second, Dr. Wandile Shilobo, who's a chief economist in the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, known as AGBIS, and the author of 2 books on agriculture and land. He's a senior lecturer at the Department of Agricultural Economics at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and a visiting research fellow at the Wits School of Governance at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Wandile has served on President Cyril Ramaphosa's Presidential Economic Advisory Council since 2019, and on the Presidential Expert Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture since 2018. He'll be talking about the prolonged drought and the resulting maize shortages that are affecting the whole region of Southern Africa. And third, the discussant who actually started this whole question in my mind, maybe back in 2020 when we were both grad students at the University of British Columbia. Now, Dr. Kushank Bajaj is currently a data science consultant and postdoctoral fellow at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Kushank's research explores the relationship between food systems and climate change, focusing on both the systemic risk posed by climate change to food systems and the role of food systems in either mitigating or exacerbating climate change. In his doctoral research, Kushank assessed climate risks in agri-food supply chains and their impact on food prices, particularly within Canada's fruit and vegetable sectors. In the past, Kushank has led research projects across environmental sustainability, climate risk and adaptation, and the agri-food and water sectors. His experience spans academic institutions, government bodies, and grassroots organizations in Canada and in India, and in South Asia, I should say. So a lot of expertise at your disposal. I want to say just a few more minutes of your time to talk about this from a little bit from IATP's perspective. So climate change cuts across all our work at IATP. As a relatively small policy institute, we're about 18 people overall, and we focus on the intersection of agriculture, climate, food systems, and trade. We find ourselves active in this debate at every possible level of geography, including Minnesota, where in part with allies, where we argued for and secured a climate policy officer now in our Department of Agriculture in the state. These are things that still don't exist, even in countries like the United States, or they're still not common. When I reread Calvin's paper this weekend, I was struck again by three things. First, that climate change has really yet to break into agricultural policy and projections, even though it's so dominant in our news and maybe one of the most sort of hot topics, including for farmers, that you'll come across. We keep setting new records, but we still see policy lagging woefully behind. It's even difficult, and when you read the paper, you see it, that the projections on what production will be, what consumption looks like, what distribution will include, doesn't include climate factors. It's still quite difficult to capture what we know in models, and even more complicated than to assess what to do with projections out of that. But even at a simpler level, even if projections are hard, even the policies and programs in the US, for example, there's no climate risk assessment in the farm credit system, none. If you go and ask for money for a loan, they're not looking at how climate change might affect your projected production, and they're not looking at how your production might actually exacerbate the problem of climate change. So we still haven't begun to really integrate this problem into the nuts and bolts of our food systems. Secondly, trade is ever more important, and that's partly because of climate change, although of course there are other reasons as well. And there are few ways to be more at risk to food insecurity than to only have your local area providing all the food that you need. And especially as weather grows less predictable, that wholly local system is not stable. But trade is also still only a small share of total food consumed. Many of the foods we like to eat are not traded, especially globally. It's less true for us in richer countries. And their dependence on trade carries its own risks. As we know, every time a war breaks out or a shipping channel is blocked, and you see the food system disrupted, the traded food system. IATP is persuaded that accountable democracies and effective sovereignty in international negotiations both depend on a strong domestic food economy in which trade is very likely to play a role, but which is not dictating the terms of investment or of land and water use for the country. And finally, and this is where this conversation started, exporting countries haven't yet begun to really have the conversations about their responsibility in providing food security worldwide. Do you see this in the, they sort of frequently like to say that they feed the world. We hear that in the US, I've heard that in Brazil, but you don't see that climate, trade, and agricultural policies in these big exporting countries reflect that responsibility. So that from the perspective of net food importing countries, there's still huge concerns about whether or not the food will continue to be there when they most need it. With all of that introduction, let me turn first to Calvin to introduce the paper and give us the highlights from what you found.
Thank you very much, Sophia. I'm going to share my screen. So I will be very brief. And thanks again to Sophia for the introduction and to the discussants, whom I very much look forward to their perspectives from different regions and how they've been looking at some of these issues. I will just want to touch on the relationship between agriculture and climate change and talk a bit about grain production and trade flows, and close with some of the risk mitigation recommendations that we were thinking about in this paper. In the paper, we focused on 3 cereal crops, which is maize or corn, wheat, and rice, which together account for over 60% of global food calories. We thought to focus on these because any shifts in production, in trade, in these crops poses a risk to food security for a lot of the world's population, especially in the global south, where these staples are relied upon for affordable food. So it was with this vulnerability in mind that we also wanted to undertake this research. We also wanted to understand the trends in cereal production and trade flows and how climate change would impact this production and trade, and then see what insights we could gain into who is at risk, both in terms of the exporting countries, but also in terms of those countries that are dependent on imports. 2/3 of the 152 developing countries are net food importers, and you have among them some large cereal importers, Nigeria, Egypt, countries like that, countries in the Middle East and so on. So for those countries as well, and also the developed countries are among also big importers. So there are risks and factors to consider for all countries, but in particular for the developing countries, which are limited in terms of their capacity and resources for adaptation and for food security and building reserves and things of that nature. So we felt this research is important. The other factor to consider was that the developing countries that are highly dependent on agriculture, or it accounts for a larger share of the economy. So again, we felt any shifts in production and trade would be more acutely felt in those countries. In this research, what I think I found mostly, there are many uncertainties, and also looking at the models and the conclusions, it points that future research is needed. Some of the earlier studies which were projecting changes to occur in 2050 have now revised to say no, actually by 2030, by 2040. So we are seeing some of those changes happening sooner than previously forecast. I think one of the conclusions I drew was the need for ongoing research, both globally, but also in particular region-specific and country-specific and sector-specific, to really understand what's happening in different countries and in different crop sectors. So we know, ladies and gentlemen, that agriculture is both a victim and a major cause of climate change. So reducing emissions in agriculture, food production and food systems is one of the challenges preoccupying us going into the future. We know that food production and food systems account for 25 to 30% of global emissions. And this includes deforestation, land use, supply chains, transportation, packaging, processing of foods, fertilizer use, another big contributor to emissions. And cereals production in their own right, also a significant contributor to emissions. And this comes from both use of fertilizer as countries try intensification to maintain yields or improve yields, and different agriculture practices that come, in some cases, change of land use, slash and burn techniques, and so on. Other areas where we identify emissions is in the supply chains that I mentioned, but also food waste and food loss. A quarter of the emissions in food system coming from food waste and food loss, a lot of it before even the food reaches the market. So another area that we felt needs to be addressed. So among my conclusions that I found in this research were that the literature is not conclusive. The climate scientists hold divergent views on the exact impact and the extent of climate change on the cereal sector and agriculture in general. and how the extent to which warming will take place and the pace and the impact on precipitation and production patterns and crop yields. There seems to be some general sense from some scientists that countries in the low altitudes or the global south, they are generally warmer than the global north, and it's felt that the global north will benefit in terms of increasing yields from increasing temperatures. But the question then is this a long run trend or a short run trend, where you benefit for a short while, and after some time, if temperatures continue to increase, even those countries in the global north will also start to experience challenges. So it certainly for developing countries in the global south already at warmer temperatures felt that they are going to face some challenges in terms of output. But this is complicated in my mind, because countries are always taking measures to increase yields. Currently now we see a lot of countries trying to do a lot of local production to improve even growing wheat in formerly arid regions where you wouldn't expect, and other grains. So to mitigate, so to what extent do these factors then change our outlook? That remains to be seen. One of the conclusions I felt strongly I observed was, as I mentioned, the effects of climate change occurring sooner than initially projected, especially in Africa, Asia, Oceania. And I saw recently a study also predicting for the United States that they are now, that study felt that strong risk of these effects also happening sooner for the United States. And so that's one thing to note. I mentioned already the issue that countries in the global south facing a disadvantage because they already have warmer temperatures. Studies that looked at countries like Russia and Ukraine, and over the last few decades, how slight warming temperatures in those countries had seen agriculture output increase. Of course, the temperature is not the only factor attributing or causing those increases. There are other factors and how one is approaching the agriculture sector. And there are mixed views on cereals production. At regional level, certainly we see different scenarios playing out, even within regions. We see, and I hope Wandile will speak to this, for example, in Southern Africa, similar climate, but countries experiencing different outcomes in terms of production, in terms of their food security as well. But what UN IPCC concluded was that climate disruption for cereal production will happen in all regions. And it's really a question of variation and shifting trends over time in the short run, in the long run. So among the conclusions, again, I continue with that. With rising temperatures, we will see some increase in yields for some crops. But for others, we'll see yields becoming lower and affected than they would be if there was no climate change. Production in rain-fed agriculture regions, especially like sub-Saharan Africa, where there's high dependence on rain-fed agriculture, and also South America, is expected to suffer or be negatively impacted due to seasonal water stress and changing precipitation, rising incidence of droughts, and also flooding, I should add. These challenges of water could be mitigated to some extent with improved governance of water. To some extent, some suggest irrigation, which also presents its own challenges for soil and biodiversity and water systems. Rice production is particularly vulnerable to climate change, given it's water intensive. Wheat also experiencing some declines in some regions, but as I said, in some areas which are traditionally cooler, could see production there. but we're also seeing some relocation to higher altitudes, elevation, and shifting to alternative crops. One may ask to what extent, for example, in the United States, we're seeing imports of horticulture increasing, and this applies to developing countries where, as incomes increase, a shifting preference or the uptake of fruits, vegetable, meat rising faster than for cereals. So again, to what extent does that impact long-run demand of cereals relative to other products? So trade is very critical as a mitigation and factor to food security and to these effects that we're seeing in production of cereals. Trade already accounts for 17% of cereal production, very important for countries that are food dependent, import dependent. And we saw this with the recent rice bans in India, with the dependence on Ukraine, for example, for wheat and corn, and even countries like the US, which export corn to 60 countries, they will be countries that are highly dependent on countries like that. What was interesting was the share of exports in these different cereals, fairly low for rice at 9%, but higher for corn at 15% and 25% for wheat. And this is expected to grow with time to 18%. The maize, mindful of time, Sophia, I'll wrap up in 2 minutes. Maize is expected to grow faster in terms of its export and trade compared to the others, but also wheat increasing as well. What's notable to me is, given that population growth is expected to happen strongly in Asia and Africa, to keep an eye on then what's happening in terms of production in those regions which face some climate challenges already, and in the case of Africa, already fairly low in terms of its output relative to other regions. On this slide, I want to just highlight the concern and the conclusion of there's a high degree of concentration. You see in our paper, we discussed this in terms of production. A lot of cereals, the top 3 countries account for 64% of maize output, 57% in terms of rice, 45% in terms of wheat. The same even in terms of projected increases with climate change and so on forecast. A handful of countries expected to account for half of the increase of wheat, for example, in terms of India and Russia and so on. So there's this level of concentration, which is very concerning for us in terms of risk for those countries that import and even for the food security of those countries that export. Also, in terms of diet, concentration is a challenge where we are encouraging more nutritious diet, a more diverse diet with veggies, vegetables, and so on, and fruits, and less over reliance on processed cereals and grains. So, in closing, this is my final slide, Sophia. Four points I wanted to highlight. Importance for countries to improve as mitigation measures their local production and regional production. Importance to reduce food loss and food waste, given its impact on emissions, but also to help with food security. The importance to rethink the focus on intensive agriculture towards more sustainable production methods, agroecology, regenerative, and so on, as a low emission pathway for agriculture production. And at country level, looking at diet is important, more healthy diets, and how we can adapt our production towards those better diets. And then I mentioned earlier already the importance of future research, looking at reformed food systems towards more sustainability. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Calvin. And sorry, it's always a lot of things. I really do encourage people to take a look at the report. those conclusions that Calvin highlighted are important, and also some of the many unanswered questions you have. There are a lot of tensions in there over what people rely on to eat, whether they should or not be relying on that to eat, what we're doing to the climate by producing those foods, where they come from. There's just a lot of questions, I think. Joe, let me turn to you first. I didn't mention in all that bio that you've also been running the Ag Market Information Systems, a G20 initiative that was set up in the wake of the food price crisis that started in maybe 2007, 2008, and that tracks public holdings of stocks among those biggest, all the main grains from all the big producers, I would say. I think the coverage is something like 80% of production. But what have your observations been on how climate is affecting cereals production and trade, especially the rice, wheat, and maize that Calvin has focused on? When you look at the global landscape, do you see trends emerging?
Yeah, no, thanks, Sophie. And let me say at the outset, thanks for the invitation to appear here. This is congratulations to Calvin. It's really a good paper. I second your comments that people really should read this report, because I think there's a lot of interesting conclusions that come out of this. I've been following this on a historical level, I guess, and one thing I'm struck with, and it's a little different than what Calvin is saying, is that actually a lot of these markets, they appear quite concentrated, but they're actually less concentrated than what they were 20 years ago. So in some cases, I mean, yes, we look at just over the last few years how important the Black Sea has been, but remember, 25 years ago, the Black Sea wasn't even it wasn't one of the major suppliers. So it was even more concentrated in one sense, because you just had a handful of the EU, Canada, US, and in the Southern Hemisphere, Argentina and Australia. And now you have the Black Sea. And I think that we saw that to a degree with the disruptions with the war, is that countries were able to source from alternative suppliers. And that's, the question is, does that continue in a context of global warming? And as Calvin suggested, if this gets even more concentrated in, say, the Black Sea, because Russia and other areas look like they will be more favorably benefit, at least in the short run, from climate change. That's certainly true with maize as well. U.S. was the major market for maize for many, many years, and so heavily concentrated with the U.S. as being the major exporter. That obviously with South America and with Brazil, you've had this big growth of an alternative supplier. And so I think those things are all sort of positive. The most concentrated market is one that isn't part of this report, but is important from a vegetable oil standpoint, is soybeans. And oilseed, I guess if you include oilseeds more generally, then it gets a little more diversified. But soybeans, essentially being in Brazil and US, and that was almost entirely a US market 40 years ago. And by 2005 was pretty much 50%, and now it's actually trending upward again, more concentrated, because it's more and more is going to Brazil. Anyway, all that's very significant, I think, and it's important to kind of then think about, well, how that's going to be affected under climate change. And I think that's where Calvin's report, I agree that that's something that will be very interesting, because it does move away. In many of the cases, the large net food importing countries become even larger net food importing countries with under climate change, and I think that will be a big challenge.
And maybe just I want to save some minutes to talk about the modeling, but just as an addendum to that is, I mean, maybe it's are there any regions where you feel that dependence is especially acute? Yeah,
no. Now here's the flip side of that, is that I do think that because of the diversity, that you do see, the important thing is in the case of a lot of these crops that are also grown in the Southern Hemisphere, that adds actually a lot of diversification, right? Because these areas, Brazil agriculture is less correlated with what's going on in North America or Europe. And so those are important buffers. But the other important thing about the Southern Hemisphere is they can respond to droughts in the Northern Hemisphere and vice versa by planting a crop and planting more of that crop. And I think we've seen that in recent times where I think some of these droughts that have affected, the world markets, the response has been fairly rapid in the Southern Hemisphere to help mitigate that. Now, again, that's one thing. The other thing, though, is the migration of production to areas that are more volatile in terms of yields. And so Black Sea is an issue because Russia wheat yields and Ukraine wheat yields tend to be fairly, are a little bit more volatile than elsewhere in the world. And they tend to be somewhat correlated with European yields. So we're currently seeing drought in poor weather affect yields in Russia and in parts of Europe. And so those all become, considerations in this food security mix. But I do think the growth of the Southern Hemisphere has been very important. And the last point, and I know you want to get to the modeling thing, is the last point is rice is highly concentrated, as Calvin pointed out, highly vulnerable to El Nino in particular. And just some quick numbers I was doing for another study on rice is that we look back at 2002, we had a pretty major shortfall in yields and in rice yields, and due to El Nino. And we had, I think the production was about 17 million tons off of trend at the time. Currently, if those same weather impacts were to hit with the current distribution of rice, et cetera, that in default would probably be closer to 27, 28 million. So it's just to say these things make a difference where it's grown, and that's the one thing about climate change is we can sort of, a lot of the models predict where it will move, but the volatility, what happens to yield volatility, and the other thing, I think most climate scientists are in agreement that things will become more volatile, but how much more volatile, I think, is the key question.
Yeah, that's when it really matters. I guess that's the other part of it when we think about rice, that it's not just what's traded that's important, but the countries that don't need trade right now because they grow a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very big demanders if they were to have a poor harvest in India or Indonesia, say. So this question on modeling I wanted to turn to is just, to what extent do you think these modeling tools have helped to shape effective risk mitigation and adaptation policies in different countries? And we were thinking about IFPRI, it has this global impact modeling system, which is linking climate, crop, water, and economic models to try and look at some alternative futures for food and agriculture. And we just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about it and give us an example where it's been used effectively. I do appreciate there's a lot more than science that decides policy, as we've discussed.
No, and IFPRI's had a long history with this. I mean, the modeling effort was begun in the 1990s. They had a very large report that came out in 2009 that really, looked at the impacts of climate change, considered several scenarios. And that's the beauty of this model, as you say, it combines climate models or allows, they have crop models and economic models, and they can all integrate these things, and water, which is the other really important thing, to kind of look at impacts of various climate scenarios or other stressors, population growth or income growth or whatever. And so I think that's been very useful. Where I think it's been very helpful is looking at deforestation issues, looking at impact of improved yield varieties and things like that on deforestation, how that can potentially, reduce deforestation. I think a lot of the more interesting papers have been on research and development, what that means for how to improve productivity in a sustainable way, and those sorts of impacts. Otherwise, I mean, the problem, of course, is these climate models, are at best sort of gross predictors of effects, right? I mean, we can't target a date, we can't target a particular impact. There's still a real big band of uncertainty around it. The other problem, I think, and it's just the complexities of these models, they are so intricate, what you would like to do is add stochastic elements to really look at a full range of potential yield outcomes and that sort of thing. That's a little trickier. I think the impact people have certainly looked at those things, but that does include, or does require to do that effectively across the board with a big model like that. There's just so much computational demands for that, and that may come, I think, with better technologies and everything. But I think there's still a lot that we could. Again, a lot of my concern, because I deal a lot with risk management issues, is the variation in these things and the potential correlations between yield shortfalls in one region versus another and those sorts of issues.
And so just to be sure I understand, so that yeah, it matters a lot whether there's a 5% or a 10% chance of something, or whether the shortfall will be this much or that much. That's what you're saying, the model?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
I think to try to, that just is a lot more, far more difficult to sort of specify, I think, and is beyond most models at this point. But I think that these things are getting better, and it impacts a great example of I mean, they've put out reports since that big report in 2009, updates and other sorts of things. And I think, looking at impact along with other suite of climate models and ag models like that, you begin to get some consensus in terms of vulnerable regions and vulnerable crops, et cetera. But again, excellent paper, Calvin. So thanks.
And thank you, Joe. Let me turn to you next, Wandile. I wanted to talk to you especially about Southern Africa. So the whole region, I think, is experiencing serious drought and supply challenges for corn, or for maize, as it's more commonly known in the rest of the world, due to the El Nino Southern Oscillation, but also likely exacerbated by climate change. How is this affecting production, and how do you see the food security outlook for cereals in the region?
Yeah, thanks, Sophia, for this. Let me start off, like Joe, by congratulating Calvin and the team. I think this is a useful paper, particularly from where some of us sit, which is the areas around policy, on thinking about how it informs decisions in the regions. And I'll build my response to your question from some of the points that Joe made. One being around the story of diversification of production. Where I would start off with is that in Southern Africa region, there's a lot of work by Tom Jane and the others that basically shows that in the increase in grain production outside of South Africa, just looking at all of the other regions, has purely over the past decade or so been through the expansion in area production. So the productivity remains a major issue in Southern Africa. And this then becomes more acute with all of these climatic, harsh climatic changes and climate change in its broader phenomenon. So you find that many of these countries are heavily exposed. If you just consider the 2023-24 season, and you look at the food insecurity challenges, I mean, many countries like Zimbabwe, Malawi, and the others, they saw just in a space of less than a year, over 1 million of people falling in the food insecurity trap. And all of this really links with the harshness of the current weather condition on the grain production. So the question one may ask is to say, what is it then with South Africa that we separate from the rest of the region? And I think the South African success lies in some of the points that I see colleagues already raising in the chart, which is around the seed breeding. If you look at the seed cultivars that South Africa uses in the production, they are somewhat the same as what you will see with the farmers in South America, in the US and the others. While in some broader African countries, there's still a heavy resistance with taking any genetically modified seed or usage of certain agrochemicals. And that has implications for productivity. And of course, that also has implications for how much of these countries go into full-scale commercialization and produce the large volumes that will be necessary. And I'm highlighting this because Joe made an important point about diversification, because we've lived through all of the past couple of decades knowing that whenever there's heavy drought, and Southern Africa is in the region that it is, we can swiftly buy grain from the Black Sea, from South America, from the US. If countries don't have money, the WFP and the others, they intervene on assisting in that. But what happens when there is a harsh drought someday in future in the US, in Brazil, and in some countries in the Black Sea? because that climatic point that we were making, Joe, about how El Nino, La Nina, and all of this climate change affect the Southern Africa region, you were right, and I think it's an important one, because when we are in the La Nina period, we get excellent rains down here. But at the same time, those rains, we are not optimizing them of saying, okay, can we produce in surplus and make sure that we have the storage facilities to keep all of this grain here for the region, and also high quality grain that can be traded globally. The point then, Sonia, that I'm coming at with all of these disjointed points is that we have about two challenges in here in Southern Africa. One, being more open to better seed varieties that the world over is producing. The lawmakers needs to be open to that. Two, we need to build on the infrastructure around the storage facilities of the grain, so that in future we can be able to respond better. As things stand, the entire region, when there are droughts like today, really goes into a difficult challenge, with the exception of South Africa, which is doing things differently on both of those. Even in this year, South Africa is surplus and is exporting nearly 2 million tons of grain out, even with this harsh drought that we have at the moment.
Thanks for that, Ondele. So I was going to ask another question, which I'm not sure around. I guess the USDA is estimating that white maize production in South Africa is expected to fall quite significantly, by 20% maybe over the previous year. And so I just wonder if you could say something about the characteristics of that decline. I appreciate that overall in the region, South Africa stands out, but nonetheless, you're facing quite a big decline in production this year.
I mean, it's a big issue, Sophia, as you rightly pointed out, because at the end of the day, the staple for the region is white maize. And I mean, Joe knows from his numbers in his olden days sitting at the USDA and now at IFPRI that over 90% of the globally traded maize is yellow maize. And you find that while rice is an important staple in general, but we have to consider the income, the household income levels in many of the Southern African countries, and the fact that white maize is still on an actual pricing level, still relatively much cheaper than what we get in the price of rice. And as things stand today, many people are hoping on two things of saying, one, can Mexico in the next quarter be able to export some white maize to the Southern Africa region? And some farmers in the US that may have planted a little bit of a few hectares under contract, can they be able to export that to Southern Africa? Because the reality is that between next month going all the way into the end of May next year, that's the period where I think the effects of the recent drought will actually intensify, and you may see more and more of these headlines about food insecurity in the Southern Africa region. And I think the colleagues at IFPRI, they've been writing about some of these things, which then for me was saying, looking at what the IATP says on his report, how do we begin to take this and formulate it in the policy side in Southern Africa, both on that story of the infrastructure, and secondly, of saying, why are people so resistant with their adoption of technology? Because at the end of the day, with all of these climatic challenge effects, it does seem that technology will be part and parcel of the adaptation method. So I think as we are adapting, we should look at the technology toolkit that we have and look at what the other regions have been doing better, and say then, how do we begin to do that? And I think the change of the mindset, which is why I keep going, Sophia, to Joe's point about diversification, because when you are thinking about policy, you're not thinking about the next 10 years, you're looking about 20 years, 30 years. We don't know how the world will change. And I think all regions should be equipped so that they can balance up when we begin to have much more challenging production conditions in other parts of the world. Thanks.
That's great. And it partly goes, I'm just going to give you a final minute or two just to talk a little bit about that was looking ahead and the importance of technology, and also the sort of uncertainties in the global picture. And would you have any comment just briefly on the sort of differences between the smallholder and larger commercial farms in South Africa? Because you are home to that, to a very extreme diversity, one might say, in terms of the farm sizes and how they respond. Do you see where that goes into the future? And is South Africa thinking, are there different strategies for those two kinds of systems, or is it ultimately an integration? What is South Africa thinking?
In South Africa at the moment, we are thinking of supporting relatively large-scale commercial farming. That doesn't mean we will leave the smallholder farmers out, but it does mean that in the typologies of farms that we have, it does best where people can focus on the commercialization and boosting the yields, in part because of that regional responsibilities that we have. But there will always be areas where smallholder farmers will play their part. What we are particularly against, and this is the official policy in the country, is the story of saying, let's focus and do only smallholder farmers. We think that for sustainability of the food systems, large-scale farming is something that we should embrace. And it's also the message that we are having conversations about with the colleagues in the regions that are in governments to say, perhaps maybe a mindset shift on that may be useful. And we will be talking hopefully in future with the people like Calvin and Joe, who are doing a lot of work in the region to think about this, and BFEP and the others. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mandile. Let me turn to you, Kushank, for the final round of these questions. Canada is a leading producer and global exporter of cereal commodities, including durum wheat, oats, barley, rye. What are some of your general observations on how climate change is affecting cereals production in Canada, and what the future trends are predicted to be? And how might that be experienced by their, primary customers?
Thanks, Sophia, for that question. And thank you, Calvin, for that brilliant presentation. Really excited to read it. To answer the question about Canada, I think Joe pointed out some really good points in general about diversification, spatial diversification that's needed. Also, I really liked his point about volatility in yields, that most of the climate sort of production trends that we see and impact of climate change in long term, we mostly focus on like what the long-term impact's going to be. We come up with like estimates like 20% decline. But what is really important is the volatility and the variability in the yield impacts. Those are usually caused by extreme weather events and not just long-term increase in temperatures or changing precipitation patterns. In Canada, one point I just want to make, I think, initially is that there's a lot of within current country variability as well. Some of the national sort of estimates sort of lose out on that within country variability in any sort of production or climate impacts. Canada, we have like 3 major provinces, prairie provinces that produce almost most of the cereal production, cereals produced in Canada. And I'm going to quote one of my colleagues' work here. She estimated that historically, over the last 25 years, there's been some benefits for certain parts of the provinces, like Manitoba and Western Saskatchewan actually benefited in the last couple of years from climate change. This is mostly because of increased precipitation in these regions and declining sort of not as extreme increase in temperatures. But at the same time, major like producing regions of Alberta and Eastern Saskatchewan really like faced a lot of negative impacts, which is mostly from drying conditions and temperatures going above 30 degrees Celsius. But this is a historical sort of picture. Going into the future, what her work, again, her name's Guinea, what shows is that overall, we're hoping, according to the models, we're estimating that there's going to be overall a decline of about 20% in cereal production from Canada on average across these 3 different prairies. So it's not looking that great, but at the same time, Canadian farmers have a lot of adaptive capacity. You have a lot of programs and policies, support from government to adapt to these challenges. So we're going to hopefully see that come to play and see how that works out in the future. To your point on how primary consumers might experience these sort of effects, I think there's going to be 2 ways that's going to happen. One is going to be the inconsistent supply, which is an extreme problem for consumers from across the world. If there's inconsistent supply, they need to diversify their trade agreements and portfolios to manage and source it from other places, which can be hard depending on your trade portfolio, bilateral trade portfolios, and other things. So that's going to be one of the inconsistency in supply, which is sort of linked to the variability in yields we're going to see from weather extremes. There's droughts which are affecting the prairie region a lot in the last couple of years, and will hopefully do that in the future as well. Not hopefully, but will likely impact the crop production from there. And the other is also the quality of the cereals. That's one thing that doesn't sort of get as much attention, is that the sort of supply or the requirements for different stakeholders is very dependent on the quality, the protein content, the gluten content, and those, because of the variability and inconsistent weather, we're going to see hits on the quality, which is going to create all kinds of challenges in terms of usability of the grain produced everywhere, but also in Canada.
That's a really good point, and presumably has those up the value chain, or whatever's downstream on the value chain, thinking hard about what they're doing with what they get. The second question was about India. As a major cereals producer and now exporter, especially rice exporter, some of the forecasts are that over half the future global production increase in wheat will come from India alone. Have the predicted climate change effects, including rainfall and drought, been sufficiently taken into account in these projections, do you think?
I think it's an ongoing research and a big debate. It's really hard to understand to what level. I think it's important. Okay, they might have included the impacts of climate change in their production, future projections, but it really depends on to what level. And our understanding from the climate and crop models is that there's a lot of uncertainty in the estimates and the long-term impacts of climate change. So those could really switch and shift the projections completely. There's all kinds of issues that the Indian farmers will have to sort of overcome with extreme droughts happening, heat stress happening in India. It'll all, I think at the end, bottom line would be it'll depend on how well they can adapt to these changes in climate. And that will always depend on the policies and programs the government has. And what I'm seeing in general is there's a very little conversation in the political spheres of India about climate change. So that is, we'll have to see how that pans out as well.
Okay, and I think, well, there's a lot more to say because India is such a huge, if it were to fail, it's one of the most arable and productive sectors in the whole world. And if its agriculture were not to thrive, that would have global implications as well, let alone what it might export. Finally, just turning to your research, which was on horticultural markets, what have you observed in terms of the trends and impact of climate change on the fruits and vegetables production? And what do you think the model of high value exports, such as horticulture for wealthy markets, do you think that's going to persist given climate change stresses on water and on temperatures, as well as on the transportation routes that these crops use?
Thanks, Sophia. Part of the reason I sort of focused on horticulture sector was because we have very little information and understanding of how climate change will impact these really nutritious foods that most people depend on, and the demand is going to significantly increase as we push for nutritional security rather than just caloric sufficiency, how we measure food insecurity, for example. We're seeing that, and that's going to also happen as incomes increase. People are going to usually diversify their consumption, relying on fruits and vegetables more. It's overall, my understanding is the impacts of climate change in horticulture sector are very limited. We've just singly focused on understanding the impact on cereals, which was important in a few decades ago. But I think as we move forward, FAO is pushing for nutritional security. There needs to be more shift towards looking at how these nutritional foods are also going to get impacted. In Canada, what we sort of looked at was we looked at Canada's a major importer of fruit and vegetables. It imports like 80% of all its fruits and 60% of all its vegetables, which is significant. So we looked at the sort of future exposure of climate change in like Canada's entire supply chain of fruit and vegetables. And most of there's more diversification, I think, definitely in terms of the horticulture sector, in terms of production. That's mostly to do with how they're not as easy to transport long distances. It doesn't have as much storage capacity as the cereals does, so they usually like imported from closer places. In terms of horticulture in Canada and high income countries in general, I think the production sort of trends are going to sustain. I don't think they're going to shift as much because of a couple of reasons. First would be what I mentioned, the storageability of fruit and vegetables. It's hard to transport longer distances. Or it also depends on the kind of fruit and vegetable we look at. Bananas are easy to transport and apples rather than leafy greens. The other thing is that coming back to my point on adaptive capacity and government fundings, higher income countries will likely or will be easier for them to adapt or move to controlled environment production, for example, like greenhouses and vertical farming. So we're going to start seeing that shift happen. There's been a lot of push on vertical farming in Canada, despite the economics not making a lot of sense for a lot of vertical farms in Canada. And just to give you an example about like funding, there was a massive extreme sort of event that happened earlier this year, where I'm from Vancouver in British Columbia. What the tree farmers here faced was an extremely warm winter, which was sort of followed by an extreme cold spell, which is extremely abnormal. It could be like the way we estimate weather extremes, it could be possible that it's not doesn't come up as an extreme, just because the way it was just the switch, the fluctuation in that weather. And what that does to tree fruits is the trees don't go in the dormancy phase, leading to doesn't go into a dormancy phase. What that does then is when there's an extreme cold spell that happens, it just kills the fruit and the bud. Some farmers faced 100% sort of production loss of their trees in just this year. But the government came out and sort of gave $70 million in compensation for them to sort of increase their production back. So those kind of resources, again, would be easier for high-income countries like Canada versus low-middle-income countries like India or other places in Africa. Sorry about the long answer, I hope.
No, there's just so many things to think about, and I can't help thinking that may work 1 year or two, but just as in the US, there's a whole kind of mess of insurance that somehow making adaptive decisions, I would say, harder than we would like. You know, you can't give 70 million every year to fruit farms that aren't producing fruits, even 3 times in 10 years. It's a lot. But also interesting that these effects are not the unpredictable part doesn't necessarily mean setting a record. It just means things are reversed or things not happening in the right order. And then how does nature adapt to that?
Absolutely.
Well, we've covered a huge amount in the range of questions. I think some of the themes that come out for me are, and maybe just any last reflections from any of you on that before we turn to some of the questions, and I encourage the audience to put questions into the chat. One is on how we vary diets and how do we see from our different perspectives, putting you in boxes a little bit, but Kushank more as an academic and Bandile looking at it from a sort of national and regional perspective in Southern Africa, and Joe, where you've been sitting, and on terms of how you ensure the investment in changing diets at the same time as you need to safeguard and protect, you're thinking about what to do about the most resistant maize crops. How do you sort of reconcile those things, and are there ways to do that? Are there better ways to do that? And I think another it's clear that countries with more resources to dispose are doing better. So maybe just any reflections on those countries that just don't have a government ready to step in, who won't be able to provide income support to consumers going short or to farmers who need some help, and whether there's initiatives or ideas there that seem promising, or that might reward a better look? Do you have any thoughts on those things, Calvin?
Yes, well, there's some questions in the Q&A. I just wanted to respond to two from Peter on the impact of the study when it comes to the advice we're giving in terms of encouraging countries to do more local production. I think this is something that I advocate for strongly. I think increased local production has a number of benefits, both in terms of mitigating risk and dependence on imports, and if done right, can improve the local livelihoods and uptake from local producers. But as with everything in agriculture, there are also challenges. In the case of Africa, for example, we are seeing a lot of land use change, with more land being put under agriculture, meaning forests are being converted. So this is where a case where we are well-intentioned, and there are some outcomes that we are maybe not so desirable. So I think it has to be approached very carefully, so we are balanced in terms of conservation and the sustainability, and also meeting this need. And maybe what the colleagues are saying in terms of the research, the development, and these things, to see how we can make good use of land and optimize it, also needs to be part of the matrix. And Bob asked about shifting production from traditional crops, if there are programs for that. I would say it's my desire to see more uptake of these traditional crops and seeds and so on. It's not happening at a pace that I like. I wish it was faster and it was more mainstream, but it is happening. There's a lot of encouraging things happening in different countries, Mexico and so on. Even in Africa, we are seeing this shift, and so we want to see it more mainstreamed. I think a lot of these crops have better nutritional outcomes and so on, given the challenges we face with obesity and so on. Thank you.
Joe, let me give you the floor.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I just wanted to comment, follow up on Calvin's comments, because I think, particularly with what we've seen in the both with the war in Ukraine and other disturbances, a lot of people will talk about, well, should we be increasing self-sufficiency, for example, or should we be thinking about de-risking? And that's a big topic now, even with exporters, to say, should the U.S. be considering moving away from China or whatever. And I think I look at these things. I come from a long career working on risk management, things like insurance, and with I think all these types of strategies, you really have to look at the benefits. And yes, the obvious benefits of diversification, for example, or self-sufficiency is, in the event of a crisis, you have some better or more secure source of food to turn to. The problem is you also have to consider the costs, and the costs are, in the case of diversification to other suppliers, is it might be that those are very high price supplies. I mean, if you're Egypt, it's hard to find cheaper wheat than what is being produced in Russia and Ukraine right now. And you certainly could buy from Canada or Argentina or the US, but you're going to pay a premium for that. So the question is, well, okay, what are the benefits? And again, the benefits are, well, in the event of a halt in exports, then you have to find wheat somewhere, and you have to pay potentially a higher price, particularly as we saw in 2022, prices shot up. And so everyone it wasn't a question of availability. Wheat supplies were out there. You just had to pay a higher price. If it's a question of insuring against price, there are other ways to insure against price, and even options and other sorts of things that admittedly are less practicable practical for a developing country or whatever. I'm just saying these things have to be considered very, very carefully. And I think what is really essential, though, if you're going to, on any of these things, is you really need to depend on a trading system that is unimpeded. That is so you don't have countries putting on export restrictions and those sorts of things. I mean, that's where the problems really come in. Like what we saw in 2007-8 with the rice market. You had almost 80% of, well, you had three of the five largest rice producers putting on, or rice exporters putting on export restrictions, and we saw rice prices just triple. And so those are the sorts of things we really need to do to ensure that trade flows. And to me, that's what we need, is a flexible system. And we need, and I think generally it works pretty well. And remember, these aren't necessarily countries trading with countries. These are companies involved with this. So, again, I think just one has to assess both the costs and the benefits whenever you're looking at these alternative strategies.
I think that's very true, Joe, but I think one of the things we struggle with a bit is the longer term costs never get factored into the shorter term decision. And so it feels difficult to, I think we've seen the cost of the kind of agriculture we have in industrialized countries is very high. And so I think there's a tension for me. I'll certainly let you come back. There's been this tension for me around the short-term practicality and the immediate availability of what you cash in, what you have, and then this, where is it headed? And this fear that it won't just be export bans, but maybe a 1 year Canada has a 40% drop, and it's, maybe it's unlikely Canada is so huge, but still its grain doesn't grow everywhere in the country.
Yeah, and believe me, I'm not. In my head, I'm also thinking about other costs, and so I don't dispute that. I saw there was a question in the chat about how do you encourage more nutritional agriculture, and there, I mean, there's been talk about repurposing support, which I think is kind of the buzzword in international circles. To me, the real problem with that, and I did a study for FAO for the Sophie report a couple of years back at looking at repurposing domestic support to encourage more healthful diets and orienting policies towards more nutritious foods. And what you find in very quickly is when you talk about domestic support, you're really talking fiscal support, not market price, trade barrier or tariffs. Yes, you could alter tariffs and probably have some potential benefits that way, but for the most part, tariffs and it's fiscal support we're really talking about. And the countries that provide fiscal support, you can count on aren't all that many. Mali is not providing a lot of fiscal support. There's very little monies to repurpose in that sense. And so the question to me is, well, how do you repurpose from north to south or whatever? I mean, that's really to me, and this gets into the question of, orphan crops, nothing, very little money goes to R&D for improving yield varieties of teff or sorghum or millets or whatever. Yes, there's some, and at least now we're seeing some focus on that. But those are sorts of the interesting issues, I think, that or the conundrum that I think we face is how to really improve those sorts of things. And then the other thing is that I think that what the study that David and Laborde and I worked on suggests is that taking support from corn and putting it into tomatoes, what you find is that if you want to support, or if you want to get better consumption of tomatoes, you're much better hitting household subsidy or subsidizing household consumption, not production, because production can go to, if it's not in the right place, there's loss and waste and other sorts of things. And I think that orienting it towards the consumer side of things is far more effective. And again, there's a whole literature on efficacy of taxes and subsidies on consumption. And I think he has to be very careful about that. But I just say that subsidizing production is a very blunt and crude way to get those results. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to dominate this. So I will shut up for a while.
Sophia, if I may, I just want to lash on to the point just very briefly that Joe is raising, because, and I will draw on a South African experience, which is not an experience of everyone, but I would caution on anything that has to drive consumption of a particular product being on a production side. You are right, Joe. It has to be on a consumption side, but the other point is that it has not to be a policymaker's point. Rather, this is a discussion that businesses and the others that are in the retail industry have to drive that. In South Africa, we have these income support, which is at the fiscal side. If a household doesn't have income, you get a particular grant. But since COVID-19, we have added another layer of that, where we were pushing people to be consuming particular foods that we view as nutritious. But what you tend to do practically, a lot of research that is coming out of the University of Cape Town, is that people do take those amount of money because of the pressing household needs and end up repurposing that for other things. It never really worked the way in practice that is actually designed to do. But if you are about to attempt on any way on that, you rather make sure that there is a clear education and promotion and packaging in a way that would work well for consumer. This one of the crop that in Southern Africa, people have been talking about this is sorghum. Because sorghum is much more drought tolerant relative to maize, they were saying, look, maybe we could be using sorghum. It also has all of these nutritious benefits. But if you look at the consumption of sorghum, it's just been dovetailing down. You talk to the top 4 food producers in South Africa, they are not seeing any strong and a healthy demand, regardless of how they package it, they market it, they prepare it in certain ways. So this is really a consumer-driven side rather than a production side as to in terms of the changes in the products. Thanks.
Mandele, go ahead, Kushank.
If I may counter that, I have very little experience compared to people in the room for sure. But just to bring up like a interesting example that I have been following a little bit in India. I don't praise the government ever, but maybe I can in this like sort of point, making this point. India sort of pushed for a millet mission, which sort of led to the UN FAO also declaring International Millet Year last year. That's come, I've seen the fund, so the government of India sort of pushed funding across the entire sort of stakeholders, not just on the consumer side, both in terms of R&D, which is extremely important, and to incentivize farmers to produce more millets. Millets is a great climate solution and to shift diets back to millets. People used to eat millets before Green Revolution and the cereals, sort of the conventional cereals came up. What they do is they're extremely drought resilient. They're less water intensive, and they're extremely nutritious, more than the wheat and maize and rice that we all consume now. But my understanding is the funding needs to go through all aspects of food systems and not just consumer. What India's sort of initiative has done is there are quite a few handful of startups that have come up now who are like changing the consumer sort of preferences in the sense they are making instant food from millets. You have instant noodles, you have like more cereals, breakfast cereals made out of millets, and all of those sort of components sort of try and shift the consumer demand in the end. I agree, consumer demand is the hardest to shift because we get so used to eating what we do. And those kind of subsidies in production and like throughout the supply chain, having more startups, pushing for diversification in diets is sort of required.
Thanks for that, Kushank. I would say also from IATP's point of view that I think demand is a huge piece of all of this, and not just consumption. I mean, a lot of the demand for the exported crops is coming from industry, not from food. So we also have that tension around the purchasing power disparity between what people would buy to eat, but versus what an industry needs for a feed sector in a concentrated animal production or in the biofuel sector, which is seeming to get another boost now with some of the climate policies that have come into for aviation fuels and things like that. So you see a lot of tension and a lot of ways in which the whole system has to change somehow. And we haven't even begun to talk about how the increasing presence of carbon pricing in some form or another, including at border taxes and so on, a lot of the technologies you were talking about, Vandelay, have a big climate footprint. And we know in the north that very poor use of synthetic fertilizer has created a very pernicious greenhouse gas problem, as well as destroyed in other industries around us, fishing industries and waterways and water use in different places. So there's also those kind of trade-offs to try to think through as we balance what we've been discussing here is technologies, government role, what business does. We haven't heard much about farmers and what farmers are asking for. And it maybe touches on some of what Peter Goebbels is raising in the chat about corporate concentration and the extent to which the markets are sort of free to diversify, because there are quite big barriers to entry for some of these markets. There are a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of trading across Africa and everywhere else that is going on regardless. Nonetheless, the big drive in commercial farming is quite controlled in terms of seeds and fertilizer provision, and then in terms of who's buying. I don't know if there's any reflection on that. I assume those companies are all doing their climate forecasts as well. But any comment from this perspective of technology or government role or sort of farmer response, particularly in relation to how much choice they have of technologies available, where to get capital, markets that they can access?
If I may comment, Sophia, just very briefly on this, and it's not to provide an answer. I think people like Kaushik and Joe probably have an answer, but to stress the importance of this work and Calvin's paper, I sit in something that is called agribusiness working group within BRICS. Last year, I chaired the global one because I was representing South Africa, and South Africa was the chair today. This year, our colleagues in Russia are chairing that. But one of the discussions we are having now, we have about 5 things that we currently, that will be presented in Kazan to the politicians. It's a whole stuff about trade and the other things, but one of the themes is around the story of climate smart agriculture and adaptation that all of these BRICS countries have. And when we invited everyone to come and share their experiences as to what they are doing, it quickly became clear that no one is doing anything that is coherent. You have private businesses and the farmers doing their own little things, but South Africa couldn't present a solid plan on the table, just like India or Russia or Brazil or China couldn't put stuff on the table. So there is a need for a global discussion around this story to say, how should the policymakers that are sitting in these tables that are sitting in be guided by this so that the private sector can also elevate this conversation, which is why myself, I think, organizations like the IATP and Joe and the people at IFPRI, this is something that we really need to think about to say in these broad discussion. It's one thing to say we have a Paris Agreement, but it's another thing of this subgrouping of the political thinkers on what exactly are they doing. And I don't think for me, the conversation is reaching on that. The reason I thought of that, Sophia, if anything, there was a sentiment around of saying, look, the EU is bringing all of these things. Perhaps maybe they are causing us challenges in our productivity. How do we begin to tell them to give us a 10-year and all of that, instead of us thinking creatively on this? I see that as a missing piece, and I hope IFPRI and the others, you really do start to help on this. Thanks.
Thanks, Vandelay. I appreciate that very much. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, no, let me just follow up on Wandelay's excellent points, because I think this is something that, I mean, we tend to concentrate on sort of the impasse we see at the WTO on sort of the standard agricultural topics, you know, of market access, domestic support, or public stockholding, or whatever. But in the meantime, you know, countries are really progressing on developing climate smart policies, contemplating border measures to address carbon. And it, you know, the real fear is that you're going to end up with a whole bunch of different systems. And I think particularly on the border measures side, obviously, where, you know, the old spaghetti bowl that Bhagwati would always talk about all these free trade agreements and this country have, getting away from the same tariff rate or whatever. I think we need international cooperation here, or at least discussion where we would be talking about how to, some notion of equivalence, some notion of measurement for that matter, because even there, I think on carbon, we have a lot of different ideas on there are international organizations that will publish things like FAO does on terms of greenhouse gas emissions for agricultural products, but this whole new area of what climate smart agriculture might be doing in terms of reducing carbon emissions, or how do we establish credits for practices that sequester carbon, those sorts of things, that is going to require some international cooperation, I think, and I think ultimately we need something equivalent to sort of a codex or something where there is some technical agreement in terms of what we're talking about. And that's we're a long way from that right now. And I think that while we have these seemingly endless debates in Geneva, we really need to, I think, get somewhere else and talk about these other issues so that we can establish, maybe some agreement on technical measurements and those sorts of things, so that we can get some language to talk about these broader issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. And that's definitely where IATP is putting a lot of energy into how that should be done, and how you move from voluntary to something more, to something firmer. And actually, it is a place where companies get involved and can be held to account, I think. We did work looking at the methane emissions from the meat and dairy sector at IATP to show how big a footprint the biggest meat and dairy companies have, like the oil industry. And then how do you understand those interests? But then also they're at a scale where laws like California has introduced laws on disclosure that will require the food and ag industry to also start to take account of its own footprint. And I also very much appreciate, Wanderlei, what you're saying about the need for a regional conversation. Paris kind of pushed a lot of things into national countries, but this paper, among many other things, is showing how this is not just a national conversation. And we feel that the national conversation has to be held and is precious. But clearly, no one is responding to this alone. And I feel in Southern Africa, it's quite acute, where you have a region with one main staple and only a couple of surplus producers, and a lot of climate effects already. A lot of things seem to come together there. Krishak, I don't know if you wanted to come in on any of you had a specific question, in fact, from an oilseed producer in Ontario. I don't know if you had a chance to see it. Donald was asking, agriculture, saying from his perspective as an oilseeds producer here in Ontario, agriculture has been pushed towards a more sustainable, more technological production model, but the fertilizer use in Canada continues to increase. Isn't it time that we talk about least cost crop production? And I don't know if you've come across some of that debate. I don't know if you feel like that's something that you would comment on.
Not so much on that debate, but there was a lot of debate about fertilizer use and the government of Canada pushing for limitations on how much emissions are contributed. But I totally agree on least cost crop production. It needs to be there, but it also needs to be more sustainable crop production. Sometimes it can be both environmentally sustainable and financially sustainable. So definitely that needs to be there for sure. And I just wanted to make another point about, I think, carbon offsets and climate smart agriculture. I totally agree there needs to be some sort of regulation or international collaboration on how these things are measured, the impact of those practices, and have some sort of regulations, and not let companies just regulate themselves. Because we know there's a lot of uncertainty in the way these carbon sequestration or soil organic carbon is measured. And we've seen that come out as problems recently with deforestation projects in Brazil and other places.
Yeah, very much on IATP's radar. Well, we're coming to the end. I think we certainly haven't done justice to all of the questions, but I hope we've been touching on at least some of them. I'm just scanning them as I speak to you. We did touch a little bit on some of the specific things like seed alteration. Maybe one final thing, and then of course any general reflections you might have, I'll give you each the floor again if you wish it. But thinking about seed systems in particular, and Vandelay, you were saying that you feel that there's a resistance to using genetically modified seeds in the region. But I wonder if more broadly the push to have greater to relax the intellectual property rules that have been kind of imposed on food systems by international law, and to allow greater space for the seeds to be developed and owned by farmers and in different systems, at least allowing more diversity of the seeds, which is a little bit sideways to the question of whether or not they're genetically modified. I just wonder if you had any comment on that in particular, the sense that a lot of farmers organizations have that there's an attempt to control seeds in the hybrid market in ways that cut farmers out and force them to be dependent on buying seed, and whether there's ways in which the systems could be at least more pluralistic.
Yeah, I think for me, Sophia, my reading or listening to a number of people, particularly in the Southern Africa region, I don't get a sense that it's farmers that are against the seeds. Farmers that are sitting in Zimbabwe or sitting in Kenya, sitting in the DRC, they want to access the seed that a farmer in the Free State of South Africa is using to get their better output. Because I mean, you get such wide differences, whereby in a rain-fed production in South Africa, on maize, you have 6 tons per hectare on average. On under irrigation, you have about 16 or 18 tons per hectare. But outside of South Africa, you have people harvesting about 1.5 tons per hectare. That's like dismal. And the whole key thing, they say, can we access this technology? But there is a much more political conversation that is outside of science, of certain groups that are able to lobby against these seeds. I mean, you saw the example in Kenya where the president was taken into court and whatnot. But I don't know if we need something around education but something has to happen, a wider conversation has to be had around that. The one thing though that I will close off with is that the domestic agricultural organizations, they do need to do their part in terms of research. In South Africa, we have a state-owned entity which is called the Agricultural Research Council. Which we try every year to put the public funds to say, can they do something on seed breeding? Can they do something on whatever areas, crop diseases, animal diseases that we deem important? So that for farmers that do not have income to go and buy technologies, they can be able to receive some of those solutions and things from that Agricultural Research Council, although it always lags behind what you will find at a Bayer, Corteva, and the likes. But then all of this goes back to Joe's point that it's easy to do that if you're South Africa, but if you are Malawi and you are struggling to meet up your numbers, what happens then? And this is where then these choices and the difficulties really lie on. But I think it's an important conversation for long-term planning on policy, because we assume no one will sit where they are. There has to be a purpose at where we're going as countries. And that may involve a range of things, even the intellectual property conversation that you are suggesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Joe, did you have any last thoughts you wanted to put in?
No, other than just wanted to thank again Calvin for the paper. That was very stimulating. It was great. And let me just echo the last point, and that is, and I say that coming from IFPRI, where we've done a lot of work in this area in terms of measuring the benefits of research and development. And unfortunately, it's certainly true that in a lot of developed countries, at least in real terms, R&D dollars have fallen. And I think thankfully, they've picked up in areas like in Brazil and China and other areas that are other countries that are putting more money into research and development. But I think if we really are keen on addressing the climate crisis, there's a lot of things we can do to do that. But one of them is to increase research and development and to spend those dollars, and it takes time. You don't put just a pile of money one year and hope that you get results. You need sustained efforts on that, and that would be my plug here.
Thank you. And Kushank?
I just want to echo what Joe said. Definitely R&D support is definitely a key part. But I also just want to say that I think we need to imagine and be creative. We need to imagine a more transformative change. We always talk about change, what is needed, but a lot of times those small incremental changes can make things worse as well. And big transformative change also requires us to move away or up, like come out of the lock-ins that people have. Like farmers invest so much money in machines and all kinds of infrastructure. It's very hard for them to change unless there's a more systemic sort of push towards any sort of change that we imagine where we want food systems to be. Just wanted to say that it's important to think in that big picture and think more about transformative change.
A man after our own heart. Thank you for that, Kushank. Calvin, I'll leave it to you to say some last words in closing.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you to the discussants. Really interesting conversation. I think for me, the key takeaway is we need to translate all these studies, our recommendations into policy action. There's a lot of research, but very limited. And I think Wandile has alluded to this at the BRICS, for example, in terms of the response. And I understand it's not easy for the policymakers where the science is not conclusive sometimes. But I think there's a general trend that they can all see that they are impacted by climate and there's need for adaptation that we'd like to see. I think what also came out to me, Sophia, is the challenges on the ground for some countries and some regions. There are complexities to the makeup of agriculture. And as I've always felt, the solutions and how we go forward will look different for different countries because they're all having complex scenarios, and the makeup of the sector, the climate reality they are dealing with is different. And they may go about it in different ways, but we are always, as advocates for the climate and for sustainability, hoping to push countries along towards greater sustainability and more sustainable practices. Hopefully, we'll have a next webinar on seeds and market concentration and issues that Pat was raising in the chat, and Peter. I think we need to talk more about those issues. And for me, I'd like to understand why countries take certain approach, given the reality they are facing and how they're feeling that that's beneficial. And we learn from each other in terms of why, and we can educate each other. But thank you again to everybody. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Calvin. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you, the audience, for joining us for this hour and a half. And yes, the to be continued, I think, is a safe closing word. Farewell.
Thank you, everyone.